couldn't be happier. My dad will be hunting the rest of the season. Hopefully he's got as good as luck as I do.
Here he comes, Dad. He's running. If he comes in the other here, I can shoot him right now. Yeah. Can I? Got him. Mom came running in right behind the Jakes. I had a very small window to shoot through, and 25-yard shot. It was awesome. Put him right down.
This is a good start to my 2020 season. This is the first day I've hunted. Took my shot about 25 yards. Everything turned out good, but you got to be out there to shoot one.
I think I heard a bird gobble at the back side of this farm. Once we get to this back pasture where I think that bird is, maybe he'll lock on and get hot. We got him. A set of spurs. That was a 10-minute hunt. Called him all the way across the pasture. He's down right there, and that's my first bird in this county ever.
We got it done this morning. This is 4th season Illinois. Pitch down. We saw him, couldn't get the camera on him as he was gliding through the air, and he landed about 80 yards out there, and he walked straight into us. And I'm very fortunate to have him. He's a big mature bird. His beard's kind of tore up, but he's got some hooks. I mean, he's got some hooks.
Well, we were able to get out of the blind finally. There's so much turkey activity this morning out in front of us. Just had an unbelievable day here in Northern Illinois, 4th season, so can't wait for 5th.
Well, what a way to round out the 2020 spring turkey season here. Had a little gun mishap there for a while. Kind of got into a panic there in the blind, but I was able to finally get it to go off, and couldn't be happier to end my 2020 Iowa spring turkey season with this nice turkey right here.
This year on the Midwest Whitetail Off-Season Series, we've been spending a lot of time looking back on some of our past hunts. And I've got one that I'm really looking forward to today. I want to talk about the hunt for Lefty that took place back in the 2016 season. This is exactly where that hunt took place, right here. I had a redneck blind on a trailer set up right here. This whole field was picked corn. But let's go back a step and let's talk about that deer a little bit and create a little bit of a context for that story. Lefty was a buck. He was 5 years old, we figured. The year before, he actually was probably just a little bit bigger even, which is not normal for a buck to be bigger as a 4-year-old than he was as a 5-year-old. It was kind of borderline. If anything, I suppose they're about the same size, but he was a really, really impressive 4-year-old. And I had to go out of my way to avoid that area where he was living for fear that I would grab my bow as soon as I saw him coming. We can go back a step further. As a 3-year-old, Lefty was living in the same area then as well. Had a lot of footage of him. The next field over was, I think it was corn that year, a little 1 acre food plot. And that's the spot where I've killed a lot of deer over the years. It's a spot that we've shown many, many times on Midwest Whitetail. Well, anyway, I saw the deer first there in 2015 as a 3-year-old. I think we can go back even further yet. There was a buck with a big fork on one side, and I think it was a 5-point side on the other. So that was the first year that we had experience with this buck. So he was a 2.5-year-old living about almost a half a mile away from here. A 3-year-old we picked up a lot on the next field over, about a 1/4 mile away. Then as a 4-year-old, he was still in that same area. Really good looking deer. Had to almost tie my hands behind my back so I wouldn't try to grab my bow if that deer would have come past. And then in 2016, as a 5-year-old, finally had the green light to hunt this deer. So I had so much history with this buck right in this area that I figured this was going to be my best chance for killing that deer. And further, this field was corn in 2016. And I always figure as soon as the farmer harvests a cornfield, you've got about a 4-day window when the deer really flock into that area. They love those fields right after the farmer picks them. I suppose they pick up the scattered grain. It's so much easier for them just to glean through the field and pick up those kernels than it is to deal with, pulling the ear down off the stalk or whatever. Some reason they really like it right after the fields get picked. So my plan was to wait until the day that he picked the corn and then bring that blind in. I've got a redneck blind on a trailer. I was going to bring the blind in the same day that he picked the corn. While he was in there with the combine, I rolled in with the blind and I set it up right here. The blind was facing up the hill. This field is about 45 yards wide, probably at the widest point here. And the deer didn't pay any attention to the blind. Like I said, they're so used to farm equipment. Had standing corn, combine comes in, combines the corn, wagons and all kinds of activity. So to bring a blind in at that time and set it in that location, the deer don't pay any attention to it. It's way different than if you let them get used to the field with nothing on it and the corn gone, and then you bring a blind in. Then they're going to be a lot more sensitive to it. So anyway, that's just a trick to keep in mind. But it did take a couple of days before the wind was right. I needed the same kind of northwest wind that I've got today because I figured he was bedding up in that area. And the reason I thought that was based on the trail camera photos that I was getting of him. Every evening in that other location, again about a 1/4 mile away, when he would show up at that camera, the first picture in the evening he would be coming from that block of timber. So I always figure your first photo in the evening is going to tell you the direction from which that deer is coming, which tells you more than likely where that deer is bedded. So I figured he was bedding up there. I needed a wind blowing from that direction to me. And finally, it was the 18th of October. I had that wind. Surprisingly, I had a north wind on a day when it was in the 70s. And I was tempted not even to go. So often we talk about only hunting cold fronts. We don't pay any attention a lot of times to the rest of the early season. If it's not a cold front coming through, we go to the office and work or we do something else. But we had that north wind and it was our one opportunity to get in here, and we knew that we had that window closing when the deer were really focused on this field after the combine rolled out. So we came in, set up, very little activity, super warm, t-shirts, sweating inside the blind. The last thing I expected to happen was to have a 5-year-old buck show up. We had a couple of does show up on that back field behind me, and something spooked them from the road and they ran off. That was early, and then we were just getting ready to pack up. We had about 10 minutes roughly left of legal shooting time, and we're like, man, there is no deer gonna come out on here. This is silly, 70 some degrees in the middle of October. And I happened to look out the window and there he was, 40 yards away, right on the edge of the timber. He had to have walked out of a trail directly across the field from me. It happened so quick I didn't even get nervous. A lot of times when you're hunting a certain deer, the excitement builds, the tension builds, and then you almost self-destruct. But I didn't have even time to get nervous. He was there, I drew my bow, shot the buck, he ran off and piled up about 60, 70 yards away from where I'd shot him at. It was over just like that. Literally 30 seconds after I saw him, the deer was laying dead, just down on the edge of the field. It was an exciting hunt for sure, but really the takeaways, there's two things on this one. The first one was using that trailer blind and coming in here the day that the farmer was pulling out with the combine. I think that's a really, really good strategy. And the other thing was just how unusual it was to kill a mature buck on a day that was that warm during the early season. We always talk about these cold fronts and hunt the cold fronts. Well, Really what it boils down to, I guess, is you need to hunt every chance that you can. You look at that hunt and you say, maybe my chances for killing that deer were 2% that day, but they weren't 0. So being out here, even though he was the only deer that showed up on this whole field, that was, just one of those days. There's always the exception to the rule. Lefty on October 18th, 2016 was definitely the exception to the rule. Well, that's it for this week's Throwback Hunt. Next, we're going to join Josh Sparks as he talks about the most interesting thing that he has learned about whitetail hunting.
Well, hey guys, welcome back to Midwest Whitetail. Today is a windy day in Iowa, and that is why I'm inside doing this right now. But Bill had reached out to me and wanted me to cover what I found to be the most important thing that I've learned about whitetail hunting in the last 4 years. And to say that was a hard thing to come up with is an understatement. I mentioned it before, but probably the coolest part about my job is how much I get to learn through the other people that I work with. And whether that be time spent behind the camera, I've filmed guys like Jared, Mike, Owen, obviously 3 really great deer hunters, and countless hours behind a computer editing different hunts, and just learning from everybody's footage, learning from my time spent in the tree, and then obviously learning from my own hunts. I kept coming back to one thing that has definitely changed as far as my approach to hunting since 2016 when I joined Midwest Whitetail. And that's just my surprise at how effective calling has been across numerous situations. Growing up, that was definitely something I never really had in my arsenal or considered. You always heard that over-calling educates deer, calling doesn't work, my deer call shy. And I'm not saying that that's not true in some places or that it's possible that you can do that. But my experience, it's definitely surprised me how well it does work. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. I've got, dating back to 2016, numerous examples, and I'm just going to kind of work through those and explain them. So let's start with 2016. First hunt that I can remember where calling really stuck out as part of our success was October 22nd, and I was in the tree stand with Collins, and we were hunting his top target buck, one we called White Patch 10. Here's this buck working behind a doe, gonna present a perfect 10-yard shot, and for whatever reason ends up running right through the shooting lane at the last second. And out of instinct, we pulled out the grunt tube, grunted at him, trying to get him to come back, and he ended up snort wheezing at us. Proceeded to go start rubbing on a tree, and was just getting really fired up. And we just kept pushing the envelope there. Collins started rattling, and then we ended up throwing one more snort wheeze at him. And we got this deer so fired up that he got stuck in a tree and ended up breaking a limb. And when he came back in, Collins shot him and ended up dying with that limb in his antlers. But that was a situation where, calling didn't really make sense, but we were able to alter that, opportunity, and the buck ended up coming back and we were able to tag him. Fast forward to November 5th, here we are targeting my #1 deer, this really heavy 8-pointer. Seen him a couple times. He's coming down the ridge right at us. And then he starts to peel around way out of bow range, starts walking away, end up throwing a snort wheeze at him. And when I say he turned on a dime, he just completely changed his direction, started licking his nose, and he was looking for a fight. This would be an example where calling worked, but it wasn't a good spot to call. He came up over the ridge, ended up not seeing anything, and proceeded to walk away. And so this again starts to I'm starting to learn more how to use calling in the right situation. And now we fast forward to November 12th, still in 2016, hunting with Caleb. And this is when I shot that really wide 8-pointer. Here was this great deer. We knew he was a dominant buck in the area. Walking the tree line, rattled at him. And here he came right down the tree line, gave me a 20-yard shot, and ended up falling within sight, and was my biggest buck to date. So 2016 was definitely a cool year as far as learning how to use calling to my advantage. And it really continued right into 2017. The first hunt that I can remember there, Jared and I were on our way back from Bill's and stopped at a piece of public land and ended up only hunting for like an hour. It was a last minute type of thing. We identified this creek bottom that happened to work for a south wind. And so we thought we had nothing to lose with the wind at our advantage. We were expecting these deer to bed, rattled, and here came this big 9-point that unfortunately I actually ended up putting a bad shot on and was not able to recover. But here's another example, never been to this place, and we threw calling into the mix and were able to pull a mature buck into bow range. So continuing with that season, Caleb and I were hunting again. Now we're at the end of November, and we saw what we thought was a really good deer. Ended up being a 3-year-old, but to get him to come in, because again, here's this deer, we spot him, it's on a different trajectory, not gonna come by the stand. Ended up using a bleat can, and it brought him right into bow range. Here's another example of a buck that wasn't gonna come, use a call, here he came. And I ended up passing that deer, but just a cool example. And so now at this point, I've talked about an example of rattling, grunting, snort wheezing, and using an estrus bleat. And not too long after that, I wanna say it was right at the beginning of December, right before shotgun season, I was hunting with Jared. And if you guys remember that buck Rex, that was one of the mature bucks on the farm that the first year they'd bought the river farm that I was hunting. And Jared had spotted him and sent a couple grunts his way, and here he came. And you'll probably remember that hunt because I whistled at him. Don't know what I was thinking, but he didn't stop. He got through our shooting lane and ended up getting downwind and then, you know, going away. So 2016, 2017, multiple mature buck encounters, and all of these experiences that really started to refine how I chose spots personally. So now let's fast forward to 2018. That was the season that we ended up moving, and so we're trying to figure out new places to hunt, and it led us to that Beanfield spot. If you remember, October 30th, we had that really nice deer come out first. I had ended up rattling, thinking that there would be a buck to the north of us in that bedding area, just a big block of timber. And sure enough, had a buck come to the field edge, and he kind of hung out there looking for what deer were fighting. And so when I realized that he wasn't gonna budge, I threw a couple of grunts his way, and he ended up coming to our tree line. He ended up getting nervous. We had a cold front coming through that night, and our wind was definitely bouncing between west and north, unfortunately, and he got our wind. Ended up running away, but that wasn't the end of that hunt. Here came another mature buck towards the end of shooting light, and when this buck was out feeding in the beans, I grunted away to my left shoulder down the field edge. He ended up coming, but he wouldn't commit all the way. Kind of hung up, looking again for something, and I ended up throwing a snort wheeze at him, and that was the last of it. He couldn't handle it. Ended up coming into bow range, checking out whatever buck was challenging him, and was able to shoot that deer. So now here we are, another example of 2 bucks that I encountered, and it was influenced by calling. And then brings us to 2019, this past season. Unfortunately, I never killed the deer, but you can just think about a couple of different hunts that come to mind. One specifically being October 26th, and we chose this spot solely off the idea that we would be able to call should we see any bucks crossing through this green field. And sure enough, here's this great deer, pops out, walking away from us, threw a couple grunts his way. He stopped, but really wasn't that interested. And not until I threw the snort wheeze did we change his trajectory to come right at us. Put us in the game, but did not bring him in close enough for a bow shot. He ended up coming at us, got into the timber, and then walked off. So the final example I'm gonna cover is actually in 2019 as well, and I was hunting with Caleb, November 26th. Here was this 9-point that we knew about, really nice deer, really far away, and we decided to rattle at him. He ended up pulling him in a lot closer. You know, he probably got to the 100-yard mark, and then we started to realize that he wasn't quite gonna come towards us, and so we ended up throwing a snort wheeze and a grunt at him. And he did respond. Unfortunately, he just crossed the fence before he decided to come in, and he was on the neighbor's side, so we ended up passing him. So unfortunately, you know, another example of where we called and the buck came in, but we're not able to fully capitalize on the opportunity. But it's just, again, you know, just kind of tie this up. The biggest thing that I've learned over the last few years is just how effective calling can be. There's obviously a lot more variables than just going out and rattling, going out and grunting, whatever it is. But in general, it was just really awesome to see how much more successful I've been once I started to, you know, use calling more often. And had I not, you know, hunted with guys like Jared or Mike or Owen, I don't think that I still don't think I would be doing it. I would assume that I don't want to educate the deer. I don't want to take the chance of spooking the deer. And I think that I definitely in some situations should be smarter with how much I call or when I call. But generally speaking, it's been very effective for me. And it's definitely probably the most important part of my hunting strategy right now. Appreciate you guys watching. In the next couple of weeks, Caleb and I are going to be getting after some of our summer projects. And before we know it, fall's going to be here. So looking forward to it, counting down the days till we can get back in a tree and have our next encounter and hopefully our next buck on the ground.
Well, that's it for this week's episode. I appreciate you joining me. We'll see you right back here again next week for the next episode of Midwest Whitetail. And remember to always dream big.